What's up, everybody? Welcome to the BT Podcast, hosted by BT Church. My name is Danny. I'm your online pastor, and really excited about today's conversation. I want to pause and say thank you for joining us. Maybe you guys are watching on YouTube, you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. We pray this conversation is a blessing to you. And if it does bless you, believe it's going to bless somebody else and share it on your social media platforms as well. For today's episode, we have on the BT Podcast our very own senior pastor, Chris DuPree, with us. Say what's up to everybody, man.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
I want to pause and apologize to you. So it took 15 episodes to finally get you onto the podcast. And so for that, I want to say that I'm sorry. I feel like you probably should have been episode 1, but that's totally cool. Nothing personal. I'm sure our schedules were just, didn't align or whatever the case may be. But man, I'm excited to hear specifically about this topic of productivity today from you, but also just kind of want to say, hopefully for this next season, we have a consistent voice of you being on our podcast. And it's really cool because a lot of people maybe who come to BT Church, maybe listeners of the podcast, they know you kind of as the man on stage, the person behind the pulpit, the one delivering the sermons every Sunday. And so from this platform, they get to kind of hear a different perspective about who you are outside of sharing illustrations on a Sunday sermon. I'm excited about today. And so what we're going to do today is kind of talk about, it's a new year, January 2022. Yep. It's a great time for a lot of people to kind of reset, to restart. They set new goals. People start reading Genesis right now. But of course,
then comes Leviticus.
Amen. So good luck on that one, folks. But also people, they're getting gym memberships, they're doing all that stuff. So it's a great time to kind of set those goals. And really the overarching thing that people want to do is they want to be productive. They want to accomplish a task list, so to speak. And so we're going to talk about today the art of productivity. And I think you have a lot of really good stuff to say about this topic because for you, one, being a husband, father of 4 kids, I know for you, your schedule is insane. Yeah. Recently, we tried to schedule time to go watch Spider-Man No Way Home. And I remember in our group chat with me, you, Christy, and Summer, we're like, how about Monday? You're like, there's a sports game that day, and Kana has a basketball game, and Noah has this. And so I was just like, just tell us what day works. And so, so I can't begin to understand the flow of your schedule, but also on top of that, you're a pastor of a church of 2,000 people. You lead a staff of about 50 people. Sunday comes every single week, so putting out a sermon every single time. And so, you got a lot going on.
Yeah, I just got real tired right now listening to you say that. So
a cup of coffee will help you.
Okay.
And so the kind of initial question I have for you when we talk about this topic of productivity is what have you learned throughout kind of your pastoral time? I know you've been in pastoral ministry for how long?
21 years.
21 years of pastoral ministry. What are some things you've learned throughout that pastoral time to kind of really practice productivity? Have you tried different things? Do you stick to the same thing, so to speak? Yeah,
that's a great question. I'd say on what I've learned, let me start there. A lot of people you said are goal setters. Mm-hmm. Not everybody, but a lot of people. That's me. Like that's my DNA. I feel like I lean into kind of a visionary approach to leadership, and so man, I love setting goals. I love, hey, what's the mountain we're going to take? What I've learned along the way, though, and this is true for myself, but it's probably true for a lot of people, is goals are great. I mean, to not set a goal. I mean, Proverbs 29:18. Mm-hmm. If there is no vision, people perish. Yeah. And so goals are necessary, but if goals are continually set without a process of productivity, they're just a lie.
Yeah,
they will never be accomplished. And I had to realize that because I feel like I'm a pretty good goal setter. And early on in ministry, I was trying to take on the world young, going to school, getting my master's degree, starting out in youth ministry, newly married, and I was going to change the world. And what I realized is that if I don't put some processes in place and kind of put some discipline behind it, then it's never going to happen. And so productivity is not the antithesis to goals, right? Yeah. It's the means by which goals become a reality. Come on. And so you show me a goal setter who's not productive, and I'll show you a dreamer. And there's nothing wrong with dreams, right? But they've got to get put into action. So early on, I learned that vision is great, but it only gets you so far. Yeah. There's a Scottish historian, I believe his name is Thomas Carlyle, and he would say that undoubtedly our greatest business is not seeing what lies dimly ahead, but doing what is clearly at hand. Yeah. And it's that tension, right? I mean, it's kind of cliche, but yesterday's history and tomorrow's a mystery. We've got today. Yeah. And so there's a place for the goal setting, But without that process, Genesis, man, that was great. 50 chapters of narrative. Exodus, cool story. Oh, wow. There's 630 laws that I have to read. And it's sad because so many people never actually get to the beauty of the prophets or the New Testament. But
right.
So I learned that. I also learned that you got to be gracious with yourself.
Yeah.
There's a place where people they're just lazy. Okay. Like, I'm just going to be honest. And obviously you got to address that and you got to do something about it. But between being lazy and being like overconsumed with busyness, there's a sweet spot of productivity, and the only way to stay there is to know you're going to mess up. In 21 years, I've had some really great seasons of just being on top of it, having a great calendar system, having someone help me with that, and really feeling like I am maximizing who I am in all the arenas of my life. Excuse me. I've also had a lot of seasons where I just didn't feel that way. And the key is to know, like, you're going to fail. You're going to miss the morning workout. Yeah. You're going to, not keep, like for me, I get kind of OCD. You're not going to keep every appointment you set on your calendar. You're going to miss that scheduled reading time or vision time or study time. And you got to forgive yourself. I'm my own worst critic. And this is a hard one for me still today. I'm in a season right now, so transparency, of not being super disciplined.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why it's been a longer season, just being honest, it's been about 4 months of not being real disciplined. One of the reasons why it's been that long is because I've been beating myself up over and over again about my failure to be disciplined and productive. And so, again, I'd say, you got to move past goal setting and have a process of productivity. You've got to be gracious with yourself. Yeah. And then one thing I just want to throw out there is, man, you got to have accountability. And so, it could be a friend, a spouse. Someone needs to be having the ability to know what you're setting out to do, and plain and simple, asking if you're doing it. And so, like for me, my wife, Christy, obviously she's highly involved in what happens. She'll ask me what I did that day, and she knows if I'm kind of frustrated with my answer, that means I didn't do what I wanted to do. Yeah. And then what I learned also is just, and not everyone has this luxury, I get it. Like, I have an assistant, Cynthia. She's awesome. You know her. She's the boss. And I just realized it's not a failure to rely on her for me to have a successful, again, process of productivity and specifically a calendar. And so probably drives her crazy. About twice a year, we reset. I'm like, delete everything off my calendar. And she's like, I spent all that time, just delete everything. We're going to take a morning, and for me, it's like by the hour, we're going to plan out. And so, but with that comes accountability, because every Monday, when I'm in a good season, every Monday we have a 30-minute meeting, and it's like, hey, what do I have going on this week? And then the last thing I'll say also, just to encourage people, is sometimes we get so consumed with this notion of productivity, and we want to schedule every minute of every day. And some people, that's how it works. What I would say, probably most people aren't that way. And so two things I would say. One, just remember that productivity is measured in minutes, but life is measured in moments. And so don't ever forget that. But also, for me, what's a great balance is to set a long schedule. What I mean by that is maybe a quarter at a time with big blocks. This is when I'm going to read. This is when I'll study. This is when I'll vision cast. And then this will be open for staff meetings for anybody. And so there's blocks, but also let each week determine kind of the more minute details, right? The macro and micro. So those are some of the things I've learned.
That's awesome. And it's interesting too, looking at the topic of productivity. Like, these are, you just see an abundance of resources being put out on this topic, whether it's leadership or resources. And a lot of it is due to these stats. And so I'll just kind of read these stats for us. 82% of executives and CEOs say that they leave office mentally depleted and exhausted. 49% that they say they struggle with rest and sleep. In an article by Gallup interviewing 7,500 employees, more than 70% of adults in their 20s and 30s are feeling some level of burnout. And that one stood out to me a lot, because that's like, or you're in your 20s, like you're barely starting your career.
You got a long way to go.
And you're already feeling that level of burnout. And it's interesting too, because it's like, well, one, if you're a CEO, like you have to, it's like you're required to put out some sort of leadership or productivity book now. But then there's still so many resources coming out. You have, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Atomic Habits. See these stats. We see all these books and all these sort of things. I want to know, like, for you personally, has there been like a book that's on productivity that you've read that you're like, not just enjoyed reading it, but it's like, man, I want to put these practices in place for my life?
Yeah. And so that's always like one of the hardest questions for me, because like yourself, I tried to be a pretty avid reader. And and somebody will say, hey, what are you reading right now? That's the easy question to answer.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll be like, hey, what's the best book you've read on this? I'm like,
oh yeah.
And so when it comes to books I've read about productivity or discipline, because they're kind of related, some of the mainstays for me, you mentioned one, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, old book, like been around forever. Stephen Covey wrote it. I read that book probably my first year in ministry, I think. It was given to me. So like 2001, first year full-time ministry in the church. And it's a great book, won't spoil it. But for me, every time I read a book, I just look for, like, what's one thing like that made that worth my time? Because I just invested, several hours, sometimes several days to reading. I'm not going to probably enjoy the entire book. What's the one thing? And so obviously the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, there are 2 habits that for me, I've tried to apply to my life ever since I read it the first time. I've probably read the book at least 7 times.
Wow.
The second habit that he mentions is begin with the end in mind. And if the listeners will just take that nugget away today, no matter what you're working on, a sermon, working on a staff meeting, working on a term paper, working on your goals, working on, hey, I want to achieve this fitness goal. We tend to be, not everyone, but we tend to be pretty good at like coming up with the goal we want to achieve.
Yeah.
But we think about the beginning of it. Like, hey, I want to read the Bible this year, Genesis, Leviticus, right? And so the premise of begin with the end in mind. And so the goal is the beginning, but what's that end? Because sometimes we set goals, and the truth is when we think about the end, it really changes whether or not we want to achieve that goal because the end doesn't seem that beneficial. And so the second habit is begin with the end in mind, and then the 7th habit is sharpen the saw. And I think we'll talk about this later in the podcast, but the premise of sharpen the saw is time away. It's, for the business person, the time away from the office. It's the work life, work family, work hobby balance. And so sharpening your saw when you're actually not. Sometimes people think that means you're getting better at your job skills. But the premise of the book is that sharpening the saw is actually when you're doing things out of your job skills.
Got it. Yeah.
So 7 Habits, another good book, 4 Disciplines of Execution. There's several authors. Sean Covey's one of them, and then I don't remember the first name. McChesney is another one. That's another one that's pretty big. Measure What Matters by John Doerr. A great book. Kind of deals with management principles, but the truth is they apply to life. And then most recently I read Mark Batterson's Win the Day. And so because that's fresh, that's just been a really... And I like the way Batterson writes. He's those other books are kind of more corporate minded. Batterson's a pastor, so he kind of has a thought process like mine.
Okay.
So those would be the books that I would say. I mean, you mentioned Atomic Habits. There's so many. I mean, we can spend the whole podcast talking about books. But those are ones that are both kind of mainstays for me, and then what I've most recently read that really impacted me in this area. Yeah,
that's good. I kind of have a follow-up question there. So there's, like I said, there's a lot of resources out there that anybody can find. And a lot of them maybe come from like a CEO world, cultural world type of thing. And then you have some, like you said, Mark Batterson, where he comes from a more pastoral perspective. Do you think there's any dangers, and if there's any pastors listening to this, any ministry leaders, of reading those culturally CEO type books versus a more spiritually minded book?
That's a good question. I don't think there's danger in reading those books. I think there's danger in only reading those books.
Got it.
And so I do think there's a little bit of a shift, which hasn't been bad. The last 20 years, there's been a shift in pastoral ministry, particularly like with what I would consider high-capacity people, to begin to kind of digest non-pastoral books, which is great. John Maxwell, which some people could argue, I mean, because he was a pastor, then he became kind of a leadership guru. But John Maxwell, a couple decades ago, really came on the scene. Of course, a lot of those books I mentioned, I think 4 books, 3 of those are from a corporate vantage point.
Right.
So there's no real danger. There people don't want to hear this. There is a business side to church, or to leadership.
Yeah.
But I do think sometimes that pendulum goes too far the other way. We are about a different kind of business, and when the church becomes a corporation, we lose the mission. So I think you just got to be mindful of that. And you didn't ask this question, but just another thing I'd say as we're talking about resources and the subject of productivity, there are so many resources out there. You said, you just read At Your Best. I just picked that one up. I'm looking forward to getting into it. And, you said, well, you feel productive when you read them.
Yeah.
I definitely feel the same way. But sometimes also I read them, and one of 2 things happens. One, because I am my own worst critic. I'll read a book. I'm like, oh, man, I suck. Can I say suck? I suck because I didn't.
You can say that.
I'm not doing this. Or I'll read it and I'll be like, that's what I need to do. Like, I've been doing this, but that's better. Mm-hmm. And so the comparison game is so dangerous. And what I'm getting at is, it's great to avail ourselves of those resources, but you have to be you. Like, you have to be you when it comes to the subject of productivity. Like I'm not Carey Nieuwhof. I'm not Stephen Covey. I'm not John Maxwell. I can glean the transferable principle, but I think there's a lot of danger. And why a lot of people actually aren't productive is because they're spinning their wheels trying to be productive by matching what someone else does. Right. And so I think we should be careful when we take in so much content to stay true to how we operate. Like, if someone's not a naturally super organized person, then someone who's writing from like a Patrick Lencioni, great. The dude's like off the charts on his organizational structure. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm never going to be Lencioni. I can read him and transfer some principles, but the danger is if I feel like I have to be that, it's just not going to happen.
Right, yeah, that's good. I love that. And I think one of the biggest things that kind of separates the pastoral world, the church world, from the business world really is the practice of Sabbath.
Yep.
Because you think about productivity is always about getting things done. You write out a task list. You want to go after that list. You want to finalize it, everything. And even though things get added every single day. But I think one of the myths of productivity is the constant need to like stay moving, to stay doing, and you kind of alluded to this already, and really like to never stop. It's that constant hustle. I got to keep going type of thing, so you feel more productive. And so really thinking about, and not just like for pastors, but for anybody listening, that it's just like, I'm a Christian mom, I'm a Christian dad, just trying to be a good parent, but also want to be productive in my work, in my family. So in all of that, why is stopping important?
Yeah. So really at the end of the day, the temptation to always be doing something, and there's always the tyranny of the urgent, right? But the dangers, you said there's 20-year-olds dealing with burnout. Like, no one, no matter how gifted they are, like I read about what Elon Musk's kind of
$50,000 house.
Yeah. But kind of his work schedule. But what's interesting is, like, if you kind of track him, several years ago, he talked about, I think, getting like 4 or 5 hours of sleep. But here, just most recently, he's like, I need about 8.
Yeah.
And so the challenge with never stopping is that you're not going to be productive. You're going to end up compromising your life somewhere. So, like, from a ministry context, most moral failure can be traced to a lack of Sabbath in someone's life. I mean, you can only live your life at warp speed for so long before you warp your soul.
Yeah.
And so you've got to stop. What's interesting is that I think today, even the context of Sabbath is somewhat overwhelming people, specifically in like the church context, because now we're getting, for the first time, I would say, we're getting some really good resources to talk about Sabbath. I know you're a big fan of like Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Great book. There's really several resources that have been put out in the last few years, but there's a challenge there as well, because we can read those books and be like, oh, well, you can read the productivity books, I don't do enough.
Right.
And you can read those, I don't rest enough.
Yes.
And the challenge is just finding those rhythms. One of the things that I thought about this past year, so I took a sabbatical last year. So 6 weeks, first time in 20 years that I took that extended period of time off. Didn't have like a schedule that I had to follow. But one of the things that I spent some time during that season trying to find is rest is an elusive reality. People are always asking, well, how do you rest, or how can I rest? And it's that sharpening the saw. There's a lot of aspects to Sabbath. I began to ask myself, there's a phrase, one day I'll write about it, but I don't know when that'll happen. I'm calling it the essential exhale, right? Because we can talk about we got to sleep. Obviously, there's certain things that are just like anatomical realities. If you don't sleep, you're not going to be productive. But I think a lot of people never actually do the hard work of finding out how they recharge. Like, there's the slow charge and the fast charge.
That's good.
And so for me, like, I like to play golf. Like, we go play golf. Like, I don't rest when I play golf. I get mad when I play golf. Right. Because
why do you get mad?
Because I'm not Tiger Woods, and so
or Charlie Woods,
or Charlie Woods. I would take that. I enjoy it, right? But it doesn't charge me up.
Yeah. And
so I spent some time really trying to think through what are some, I enjoy spending time with my family. But again, you said I have 4 kids. Sometimes that can be draining. And so I think it's finding what works for you on the rest side of things to help you be productive when you're on when you're on the clock, so to speak, and feeling okay with that. So like for me, what I found is I love to read, but one of the things that actually is part of my Sabbath is mowing my yard.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's not resting. It's just something. I mean, it's something that I share with my dad. You know, he's passed away, and so it reminds me of time with him. But also because the work of ministry, like so little of what we do is actually done ever. And I love the fact that I can wake up on a Friday morning, like mow my yard, and 2 or 3 hours later, it's done. Like I can see that. And so
see a win.
So all that to say, I think it's just, you talked about rest. It's critical for the soul, no matter if you're in business or ministry, a student. But you it's funny, we're talking about rest, but there is some work involved to find out how you best recharge.
That's good.
So
I would love to kind of get into a little bit. I've honestly been wanting to talk to you about this for a while, but you mentioned that you took a Sabbath for 6 weeks. It was kind of over the summertime leading up to the fall semester. You said it was like your first time. I would love to kind of hear from you because I think that idea of Sabbath to like a business-minded person may not make sense.
Sure.
They're like, oh, a vacation makes sense. Go take a week off, whatever the case may be. And so what's like I guess the purpose of Sabbath, and then even thinking about the length and the time of which you took your Sabbath, but also like what were some of the difficulties of that? Because I know for you as your personality, like you're a highly effective person, you want to go after these goals, but then a Sabbath is literally you kind of went from going 100 miles an hour to almost like stopping. Yeah. And so I would love to hear kind of the tension that maybe you faced, but also like the joy that you faced in that time.
Sure. And so, yeah, it's kind of a foreign concept. So we talk about, let's clarify some of the terms, talk about Sabbath and Sabbath can be, it can be a day a week. It could be a half a day. It could be, Sabbath is everyone, regardless of what arena they're in, they need to practice Sabbath.
Yeah.
In the church world, it's not really in the business world. We kind of amend the word. We call it sabbatical, and not every church does it, but it's when a church, the leadership of a church, will graciously allow the pastor or staff members to have an extended time of Sabbath, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I've heard of some being 12 or 6 months long. I know some churches that don't do that, and I'm not saying it's do or don't, but obviously the business world, it's like you said, kind of unheard of. Some of those stats you said earlier about all the burnout in the corporate world, part of me thinks that maybe if the corporate world would take the model of a sabbatical, an extended, not vacation, but an extended time off, maybe we would see those numbers drop. And so for me, it was 6 weeks. It wasn't a vacation. I mean, there's vacation elements. My family, we went to the island for a week, and so that was a good time. But for our church, when we instituted a sabbatical policy several years ago, it wasn't to give staff members more vacation time. It was to give staff members time to reevaluate, reassess, reconnect sometimes. And so for me, I could talk a long time about this, but just to kind of be brief, going into it, my goal was to reconnect with some ministry leaders or just people in my life. And so like I went and spent half a day with my Greek professor from college. I accepted Christ in college, immediately became a biblical languages major. And so this guy,
logically,
so this guy, Dr. Gary Gramling at Howard Payne University, I was in his classes, and he just had a profound impact on me, and specifically my desire to know God's word. And I haven't sat down with him since 2001 when I graduated. And so 20 years later, reconnecting with him, I connected with others. Also kind of reaffirming my call, right? It's been 20, at that point in time, been 20 years, 10 years student ministry, 10 years as a senior pastor, and just, God, you have my yes, what's next? But kind of the rhythm, the more practical side of it, you say what was hard. And so what I did is, as soon as I took sabbatical, I immediately went out of town. And so part of the time I wanted to be alone, and then part of the time I wanted to be with my family. And so I drove to Dallas, spent some time with my brother, but I ended up early on in the first week of my sabbatical, I flew to New York. Some people go to, secluded cabins. Yep. I get that. I want to be alone, but I want to be around people. That's just kind of I like the urban setting. Yeah. So I went to New York by myself, and, I flew in on a Saturday. I won't go into all the details, but things like I flew in and I checked my email and my hotel was canceled. I'm frustrated. Right? I'm like, oh, man. And I got there on Saturday, and I really just kind of aimlessly walked around Manhattan because I already was like, man, I'm not doing anything. I'm not productive. This is dumb. I came by myself. I'm ready to go home. And it really took me Saturday and a little bit of Sunday morning to kind of get out of that. and then the rest of the time, that time, it was about 5 days in New York. That time really set me up well for the rest of my sabbatical, because what I did is what I would love to do, but I don't have the luxury of doing because I have a job. Mm-hmm. And so people ask me, hey, what'd you do in New York? I'm like, well, I read. And that's all I did. I mean, I stayed down, kind of by Madison Square Garden area. And I just woke up in the morning. I walked to a park, and I read till it got dark. And maybe I'd go to a different park. I'd go eat lunch. And so for me, reading is one of those slow charge things. And so what I did to start my sabbatical for about 5 days is just stayed plugged into a slow charger. Nice. And that really set me up well to maximize the rest of the time. One thing, just kind of in closing, if anybody is coming up to maybe to their first sabbatical, that I didn't do well, honestly, is I don't think sabbatical means you abandon all of your routines and disciplines. And I did. Yeah. And so for the first time in, again, 20 years, I lived a completely undisciplined, I didn't work out, I didn't eat well, I stayed up late, I slept late, I had no measures of productivity. I don't think any extended period of time with no measures. Okay, I mean, I read a lot. That was productive. But what I'm saying is that my life is fast-paced. I mean, I've got kids, and school was starting, and pastoring a church, and I don't think it serves me well to not kind of build back into my rhythm some productive discipline. Because when I came out of sabbatical, it was 100 miles an hour, and it's been that since. And that's why I said at the beginning of the podcast that I've kind of felt like I've been in a season of not maximizing productivity, because it's taken me a long time to reestablish those rhythms and those processes of productivity.
That's good. I loved hearing all that. And I think it's good for our people to hear that too, kind of how that went for you, really. Because I know people heard that, and you were gone for a season, and then you came back and all that stuff. And so one of the things you mentioned earlier is that the kind of recent book you just read, Mark Batterson, Win the Day, has kind of been like a high for you. You just read it, motivational. For me, that has been Carey Nieuwhof's At Your Best. I mentioned earlier that I get kind of excited reading a productivity book, because then I feel productive even though I don't implement anything a lot of the times. But for this one, I
gotta be gracious, man.
That's true. Yeah, I'm okay. I do feel like for this one, it just kind of clicked a little different. I love the kind of layout of the different zones.
Right.
And so you look at the green zone, yellow zone, red zone, and you're kind of trying to identify when you're at your best. Green zone being like, all right, this is a zone. No one's gonna bother me. I'm gonna dream. I'm gonna write. Kind of whatever you do as far as your job and your position, your passions. And then obviously red zone is like, don't talk to me. I'm not gonna make an important decision right now. And so kind of thinking about you personally, what are some of the best hours of your day when you feel like your mind is fresh, you're passionate about something, you're writing your best material, sermons, or whatever the case may be? And then kind of on the flip side of that, what do you feel like are maybe your worst hours where you're like, I'm not going to make an important decision right now?
Yeah. I would say in the season that I'm in, and I'll come back to this because I think those zones change as we go through different seasons of life.
Yeah.
The season that I'm in, my green zone is, and there's some fluctuation, but it's going to be somewhere in the 8 a.m. to around noon to 1. Mm-hmm. Some people, they get out of the bed and, man, grab the laptop. I got to go right now. I had this dream, and I've got to, I'm just trying to sleep at night. I mean, and so that's not me. When I get up, I want to accomplish a task. That just makes me, kind of feel good about that day. So when I'm really kind of firing all cylinders, that's a workout. So I get up and exercise. And for me, it's just, again, sometimes life will dictate those zones, and it may not be your natural zone, but your body and your mind adapts. I can't really make earlier than 8 my green zone, because I'm going to get up and I need some time to wake up. So for me, that's working out, getting in the shower, those things. But then around 6 to 6:30 a.m., it's 100 miles an hour at my house, because I try to help take the load off of Christy. As she's a school teacher, and so she has things she's got to get ready for that morning. So I try to get breakfast made for the 4 kids. I try to get lunches packed, get backpacks packed up, and then it's out the door to get people dropped off, and then try to get here at the church, in that 8 o'clock window.
That's good.
So that time frame is when I try to really have some time during the week where I tell Cynthia, hey, this is I'm not available. I need this time to be writing, to be studying, to maximize some of my potential and productivity. What's interesting to me is that 15 years ago, I would have said that if 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. is right now, 15 years ago, I would have said it was 8 p.m. to 1 a.m.
Yeah.
And that was, I became a night person in college, did a lot of studying, of course, a lot of procrastination. So, but, before I had kids, that was just a window where for whatever reason, I felt ready to go, and so I was working all the time. I was in school, part of that, and but I really did. I mean, I stayed up real late and got a lot of stuff done. And for me, I'll just say this to wrap up: we have to let ourselves go through that season of transition.
Yeah.
And so for me, right, when I was 25, didn't have kids, midnight, like I was just getting started.
Yeah.
At 42 with 4 kids, I'm like midnight. Oh my God, I'm already thinking about all the sleep I'm not getting,
right.
And I got to wear reading glasses now. And so it's harder to read at night. My eyes get tired. And so I probably delayed maximizing some of my green zone transition because out of pride, I was like, no, I'm a night person.
Right.
And I had a window where I kind of delayed it. Nature took over and I had to accept the fact because I was falling asleep at the kitchen table trying to work. But so I'd say a long answer there, but I'd say that 8 a.m. to right after lunch.
That's good. Yeah, I love you said kind of that, like be okay adjusting depending on your season of life, because for probably like you said, a young adult who is maybe going to Bible college, they're gonna love that night time frame. They're gonna stay in bed till 10, 11 a.m., something like that. But you have to adjust as the season approaches. And I think if we're not willing to adjust, that's when maybe anxiety is gonna click in.
For sure.
Because then what happens is you feel like for so long I've been this way, now I have to be this way, and I don't like change and adjusting.
Yeah.
And so I love that. Just kind of the whole, even going back to the beginning, of being gracious to yourself when it comes to this topic of productivity. Last question for you, bro.
Yep.
Looking at 2022, what are some of your personal goals that you want to try to go after?
Yeah. And so, I said earlier, big goal person. Usually by now I've got, I try not to make a bunch of them because that's just not going to be realistic. But I usually have like 3 in, ministry, 3 in personal, whatever. I've always got a reading goal, but really, I'm taking a different approach this year, and what's different for me is I don't have this big list of goals that I want to accomplish necessarily right now. My biggest goal, as I shared earlier, I'm coming out of a season of not being really disciplined, and discipline will always be connected to productivity, and I believe that disciplined productivity will also be connected to rest, because if you're not getting stuff done, guess what you're doing? You're working all the time, and good. So. For me, it's getting back to that. And so it's, I've talked to Cynthia. I was like, hey, get ready. First day back in the office, that morning, we're doing the calendar reset.
Yeah.
So it's prepping for that. It's being mindful of that, and accepting the discipline, talking with my wife about how I want to maximize, do better next year. A resource I didn't mention earlier, there's a guy named Michael Hyatt, has some great books. He was an editor for a publishing house. I don't remember, maybe Thomas Nelson, one of the large publishing houses. Really productive guy. He writes a lot about like productive meetings and stuff like that. He has a resource, of course, you got to buy it, and it's called the Full Focus Planner. It's kind of old school. It's like pen and paper notebook, right? And it's set up to take a quarter at a time. And the premise of it is you set annual goals, but then you break the annual goals into quarterly objectives, so to speak, that you're going to tackle. And it only works if you got to you really got to carry it with you everywhere. And so every morning you got to get into the journal, and every night you have to get into the journal. And so when I've done that for a few seasons and done it really faithfully. For me personally, when I've kind of maximized that full focus journal, have probably been my most productive and most restful season. So that's a big goal for me is just being more disciplined again. And then I am starting school in January after a 17-year break.
That's a long. What are you doing?
I don't know. I'm going to finally, a dream of mine, pursue a doctorate degree. And so...
Dr. Chris DuPree.
Yeah, that's why I'm doing it really is... I want my wife to call me Dr. Chris. So.
We're going to have to change all the business cards up front.
No.
Man, it's good. I love one, praying for the school journey.
Thanks.
Because now you're going to have to adjust your entire calendar again to be productive now in school along with everything else. So that'll be a fun season to hear from.
But fun is what I would call it.
I love the goal settings you have for yourself are more kind of a lifestyle goal versus maybe I want to do this specific thing.
Right.
And I feel like I heard this maybe in a podcast somewhere, but this idea we can set a goal to run a marathon, which...
Why?
Right. Yeah. It's that seems impossible.
Probably sinful.
or you can set a goal of becoming a runner. And so because then when you accomplish that one goal, you're like, all right, what do I do now? But they're kind of more of that journey, rhythm, lifestyle, developing that lifestyle versus just trying to accomplish like one thing. Can kind of be more beneficial maybe for the long run in your physical health, spiritual health, whatever goals you have. So, man, thank you so much for joining us today for the episode.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, and I know for me, I got a lot out of it. If hopefully the listeners did. If they didn't, well, watch it again. I don't know. But it was good. So as you guys are setting goals for 2022, as you're trying to accomplish things, we pray that one, your ultimate goal is simply to grow closer to Jesus.
Absolutely.
And as you go about work, as you go about life, we pray this conversation was a blessing to you.
And just to interrupt you one last time.
Yeah.
What you just said is obviously the ultimate goal to be like Christ, and the whole illustration of the run a marathon versus be a runner. Last thing that I would say is that when you strive for rhythms and processes of productivity and you strive to set goals, one of the things that was transformative for me is transitioning from thinking about what I want to do and focusing on who I want to be.
Yeah, that's good.
And let my goals and my calendar and my disciplines shape that.
So. That's good. I love that, man. Last wisdom nugget there. And so, man, for everybody listening, thank you all for joining us. And thank you for being on the BT podcast.